Welcome to the first of many YouTube lectures. I know it's really not that exciting to listen to me while you stare at a black screen, but hopefully this information will prove to be valuable as you prepare for the assessments. I won't necessarily cover every single detail. I can't do that in this short amount of time, but I'm going to do my best to provide a summary of all the relevant information that you'll need as you get ready for the test. Well, the narrative needs to begin in 1492 with Christopher Columbus, and while there's not a huge emphasis on Columbus in this particular test, it's important to understand the impact that he had when he came from Spain to, quote unquote, India, which of course turned out to be the Caribbean. And without any natural protection against the diseases that were coming from the old world to the new world, you're going to see essentially a decimation of the native, particularly the Taínos Indians. But before that even occurred, as we know from Howard Zinn telling the story of the Spaniard de las Casas, the treatment of the Native Americans was especially brutal, particularly because Columbus and his men were looking for gold to make sure that their whole journey was worth it. Yet at the end of the day, there simply wasn't the gold in the Caribbean like there would be in South America. Yet Columbus and his men, particularly his men, even when Columbus left to go back to Spain, refused to accept that as an answer. The way that they treated the natives, particularly the women, was atrocious, to say the least. And so it's important to understand that this start, particularly the start of the first European country to make a major impact in the New World with Spain, is certainly an ignominious one. The term the Columbian Exchange uses Columbus by name, but it's not necessarily his fault per se. It's just what exchanged between the New World, again, North America, and the Old World, Europe, after his quote-unquote discoveries in the late 1400s. So when you think about the deal, if you want to think of it as a deal, it seems that Europe got the much better of the deal, in part because they got corn, they got potatoes, which were really instrumental in helping population growth and helping people stay alive, which in turn is going to have an impact on Europe industrializing much earlier than the Americas. Yes, I didn't mention rhubarb, which, as far as I'm concerned, really is a fruit. Coming the other way, however, from Europe to the New World, was a ton of disease that the natives, as I mentioned earlier, simply were quite vulnerable to and had a devastating effect on. Now, one positive that we don't really talk about, but it is important in the long run, is this introduction of horses and goats and cows that is going to play a major role for Native Americans, particularly in the plains, as they move from being much more sedentary to actually riding horses and hunting bison. But much of that story will be told later on in the 1700s and 1800s. So obviously, after Columbus and his men arrive in the late 1400s, we're going to start to see the movement of different countries in Western Europe trying to get a foothold in North America. So we're going to have the Spanish, we're going to have the French, and we're going to have the British. And all of them have different relationships with Native Americans that ultimately will have an impact on sort of what their presence is going to be long term. Now, the Spanish, of course, the first to arrive, are driven by this idea of God and gold. And again, they'll find gold in South America, but they will not really find it in North America. So the idea of God was that they are on a Catholic mission and that somehow they are destined to be able to come to the New World. And so this idea of the requerimiento, which was essentially forcing natives to convert, oftentimes right there on the spot, or sometimes in what we call in absentia. So they would just sort of give the requerimiento this, you will convert right now speech to an empty beach and just sort of assume that they've done their due diligence right now. Of course, it was read in Spanish, which the natives didn't understand. And it goes back to this whole sort of religious justification for why they could do what they do, which allowed them to take the land because they were doing this in the name of Christ, particularly sort of the Catholic faith. Now, we're going to see this sort of movement from looking at people as uncivilized or lesser beings that need to be converted. And we're going to see that sort of play out as well in what's called the encomienda system, as well as in the mission system. And the encomienda system essentially gave Spanish rich dudes land that they could do whatever they wanted with. Now, they told the Native Americans they were doing this for their own good because they were going to protect them. Protect them from who is certainly a good question you can ask. But what it turned into was essentially a forced labor system where these Spanish wealthy men had their own little fiefdoms to rule over. Now, a bit of a combination seemingly between the goals of the Requerimiento and the encomienda system is the mission system. And while this was explicitly religious in terms of converting natives to Catholicism in a much sort of less violent way than the Requerimiento, but the mission system sort of combined the two. It was the religious elements that you saw in the Requerimiento and sort of the living amongst the natives element that you saw with the encomienda system. So what you would have with Spanish priests who'd go into an area, they would learn the language, which of course is different than the Requerimiento, given in a language the natives didn't understand. And their goal was to turn the natives essentially into Europeans, so that they would accept European culture, accept Christ, accept Catholicism. And these relationships that you saw in the encomienda system and in the mission system did create intermarrying between Spanish and native women. At the end of the day, this was certainly not stories of great romance or necessarily all that consensual, but it did create a major mixed race class called the mestizos. And it's important to understand that that is a major impact that you're going to see, as mestizos are a major part still of Central and South America. The French are going to have less of a presence than the Spanish did, or certainly as the British did, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But it's important to understand that the French had actually many of the same missions as the Spanish. They were there for God and not necessarily gold, but to make money off of beaver pelts. And so you could quickly say, well, French, Spanish, same goals, probably the same impact. Well, they actually went about it quite differently. In terms of the profit margin, they were looking to trade with natives who had expertise. Without the natives, they really couldn't go in deep into the river system and have access to these beaver pelts. So they had to deal with them in a much more what we'd call egalitarian or even manner. And so they treated them really as equals as part of this trade. In addition, when they went and tried to convert, they did so in a way that honored the native culture. Certainly tried to look at the ways that you might be able to find common ground between the native religion as well as Catholicism. Again, they also, like the Spanish missions, learned the language. But in this case, the relationships that emerged between the French and the natives, in many cases, were consensual. They were romantic. They actually did form community together. So despite the fact that you had same motives as you had with the Spanish, you had a very different outcome. So where you have a mestizo class where you almost say, oh, wow, that resulted from something that certainly might not have been voluntary. The métis, who were the mixed race between the French and the natives, really were products of people that got together as families. The British are a bit more complicated because, like the Spanish and the French, they are sort of God and gold, yet they're not God and gold at the same time. You've got your gold people going to Jamestown, and you've got your God people going to Plymouth and Mass Bay. So because they're not unified in those motives, you're not going to see the same sort of impact overall. And even when they are about God, it doesn't necessarily impact the Native Americans in the same way that it did with the French and the Spanish. Generally speaking, the British interacted with the natives far less than the French and the Spanish did. And while there is going to be, an effort to enslave, like you saw in the Encomienda, well, there is going to be an effort to convert, like you saw with both the Spanish and the French. In neither case does it really sort of take off, or can you say that the British were all that successful? The main British mindset was, how can we make money relative to the Native Americans? And since they weren't fur trading, and they weren't necessarily seeking gold from the Native Americans after those early days in Jamestown when they figured out that there's not gold, the question was, how can we barter? How can we have an exchange that benefits us? And they do work with the Native Americans at first, but pretty soon they determine that they don't have that much to offer them, but what they do have to offer them is land. And so you can do your steps 1 through 7 all the way from Native Americans having land through pan-Indian alliances like King Philip's War. But what we want to look at is, yes, At the beginning, there was some help that was offered, be it in Chesapeake from the Powhatans or even the separatists at Plymouth with Thanksgiving. But pretty soon you're going to have major issues, be it 30 years of Anglo-Powhatan wars in the Chesapeake or ultimately getting to King Philip's War by the 1670s. The French presence in America will really be done in 1763 with the French and Indian War, and the Spanish will ultimately lose. Spain will lose to Mexico. Mexico will have land, and then essentially in the mid 1800s, that land will come to America. So what we're going to focus really on is the sustained British presence, which of course starts in 1607 in Jamestown. But you can't just sort of jump to Jamestown. You have to figure out, how do we get there? Why is it that the British hadn't tried to come over first? After all, between 1492 and 1607, you have over 100 years. Why didn't the British just follow the Spanish here? Well, they couldn't, because Spain ruled the Atlantic Ocean. And so it took developments in England, particularly the rise of nationalism under Elizabeth, the sort of exploits of the pirates like Sir Francis Drake, who were using faster ships than the Spanish had, and then finally the ill-fated attempt by Philip II to try to sort of put down England once and for all and say, you left the Catholic Church, you seem to be sort of an upstart country, we're going to nip this in the bud. And so in the Spanish Armada, Philip sends his ships expecting to quickly take out the British fleet, and the opposite happens. And Britain wins, sort of seemingly somewhat miraculously, which doesn't put Spain completely out of the picture, but in some ways is the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire, albeit it will take a good another 300 years for that to happen. But it opens up Britain's opportunity to now move across the Atlantic. But even then, they need people that are going to want to do that. So why would anybody want to leave Britain at that time? Well, many men were having economic problems. Either people were poor and looking for opportunity, or people were rich, but not rich enough to have enough land. They were just poor enough to not get the land, and so they find themselves in a position where they're looking for opportunity as well. And so the opportunity comes, of course, in what we know as a joint stock company, which really is where rich people put up the money for these voyages and for this exploration, hoping that people that go to the New World would find riches, i.e. gold, and be able to give it back to the investors, and the people that did get to come would be able to sort of forge their own life, and they would benefit as well. The story of Jamestown is, in fact, an entirely pathetic one, and the fact that this is sort of the beginning of our country is certainly interesting. And as we know, they did everything wrong. They landed themselves right there in the middle of a Native American confederacy. They landed themselves in a malarial swamp. They had people that didn't want to work. They were ill-suited to work, even if they wanted to work. You have, very, very high death rates overall. If you're looking at how many people survive not only the trip over, but actually, the first winter. So it really should not have worked, particularly without any women or many women whatsoever to, give stability and order to the society. And it does take John Smith famously, who says, if you don't work, you can't eat. But even then, after he sort of brought order, he actually went back to England after a gunpowder incident or injury, I should say. And even then, you're going to have the terrible starving time where, as we know, there may have been people that were dug up and eaten along with, all sorts of dogs, cats, rats and snakes that were also there. And part of the reason that they struggled so much is not only was it, tough to get people to work, but it was also that they were completely surrounded, and that they essentially were almost kept hostage inside the fort by virtue of the fact that they had the Powhatans all around them. The savior is, of course, the brown gold, the tobacco that John Rolfe, not John Smith, that John Rolfe, quote unquote, discovers. He refined sort of a recipe, quote unquote. And what he was able to do was to take this, seemingly stinking vile weed, as Britain had said before, and create a major market for it in Britain. Only problem is that once you have this product, you find that you can't keep replanting it in the same place because the soil becomes infertile. And so you're going to need more and more land. And as you need more and more land, you're going to need more and more labor. So this question of land and labor is really going to transform the Chesapeake, as we talk about in the next installment of this lecture.